as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look it up. I'm curious what stacks when it comes to enhancing cognitive function, stacks or techniques or biohacks, whatever the things that you would whether it's infrared therapy or TDCS or anything else for enhancing cognitive function that you're doing now that you don't think you would have actually discovered had it not been for some of the folks who you've had on your show.
Oh, there are a ton. And I would say that in general, maybe we can come back to this, but I've become more conservative about doing things to my brain in a direct fashion. It's a pretty sensitive instrument. And so I've become less aggressive with taking what you might consider smart drugs. So I'll tell you what I'm doing less of. First is consuming drugs that are indicated for, say, dementia and Parkinson's and so on, right? Back in the day, I was fascinated by Deprenyl and other types of pharmaceutical grade compounds that I'm no longer terribly gung-ho about using myself. But here are a few of the tools that I have played with. Now, I did use TDCS, so the transcranial direct current stimulation. Also have experimented with alternating current stimulation and direct magnetic stimulation, and had the chance to, in fact, be a subject in an experiment at UCSF, University of California at San Francisco, in the Ghazali lab. So Adam Ghazali, who's a PhD MD, who was on the podcast, had me in, and ultimately that study, which looked at the combination of TDCS and a game called NeuroRacer, was on the cover of Nature magazine because they were able to, and I'm simplifying this, of course, but effectively reverse cognitive decline along a couple of metrics so that 60-something-year-old subjects reverted to 20-year-old or 20-something-year-old performance. And the most fascinating part of all of this is after they ended the intervention therapy, 6 months later, I shouldn't say most, but many of the effects persisted 6 months later. So that's very interesting to me. I personally decided that I am going to wait before doing a lot of TDCS, but there are things that I am using. For instance, I become very interested in, and this might seem old school, but different forms of inducing ketosis. I know you're familiar with this, whether that is exogenous ketones or fasting and supplementing with, say, different types of MCT oils and powders. And the reason that became so interesting to me is that my priorities have shifted a little bit as it relates to brain function. And that was catalyzed by Lyme disease. And I think Lyme disease is very overdiagnosed. I think it's misdiagnosed. I think there are many charlatans with ridiculous therapies, and these people prey on the desperate. However, I grew up on Eastern Long Island. Everyone in my family has had Lyme. It has one of the highest density of black-legged ticks, which a lot of people call deer ticks. So I was bitten by 6 ticks, nymphs specifically, which are in the life cycle you have to be most concerned about. I didn't develop a bullseye rash, and I mistakenly assumed that meant that I did not contract Lyme. And consequently, I ended up catching it about 9 weeks later after the symptoms became so severe that I was slurring speech. I couldn't remember close friends' names. My joints were so swollen that I had trouble getting out of bed. And I was at 10% capacity for, say, 9 months. It was the scariest experience, certainly cognitively, I've ever had. I felt like I had dementia. And in some ways, I probably did. So what reversed that for me, and I've seen this in a number of friends who have reached out to me with Lyme as well, was deep ketosis and using more sophisticated tools than were available to me, say, in 1998, 99, when I first started experimenting with cyclical ketogenic diets and things like this. So with Precision Extra in hand, XTRA from Abbott Labs, which I know you're familiar with, which I favor over the say, breathalyzer models that you plug in via USB. They're just more detailed with the finger pricks for
blood is more accurate. It's just less convenient, especially if you're typing frequently.
Exactly. So that being said, I was able to then identify, once I hit 1.5 millimolars in blood concentration of ketone bodies, it was one of the most mind-blowing transitions I've ever experienced physiologically. I went from feeling like I had dementia to next morning waking up and feeling like old Tim back at 100%. It was unbelievable. And I have thoughts on why that might be the case, whether it's mitochondrial dysfunction or problem with carbohydrate metabolism related to Lyme or one of its co-infections. But suffice to say that completely reverted me to my old self. And to this day, I feel like I have overcome or done away with the symptoms of Lyme. So I still feel that way, even though 90% of the time I am not in ketosis. I'm probably following this low carb diet in some fashion or another.
Yeah.
And that came from primarily Dom D'Agostino, who's a PhD and well-published researcher in Florida, who happens to also be able to say deadlift 500 pounds.
Yeah, I was going to say he can also lift a crazy amount of weight.
Yeah, he's a beast. And Peter Attia. So Dr. Peter Attia, close friend of mine, one of the most impressive doctors and well-credentialed doctors that I've ever met. So those two, who both have athletic backgrounds, have walked me through some of the subtleties and details and shortcuts in some senses as it relates to ketosis, rapid induction of ketosis, and so on. So the longest chapter in Tools of Titans, well, there are 3 really long chapters, and they're all related to your question. The first is Dominic D'Agostino. It's a long chapter on the details of fasting and ketosis primarily, but it talks about how I've formed a regimen and schedule for myself related to these things. The other 2, which we may not go deep into, it's completely up to you, are related to psychedelics, and specifically with a focus on psilocybin. And then in a separate chapter, ayahuasca, which has become very trendy to talk about, which I think is dangerous in some respects, it becoming something casually discussed. And then ibogaine, which has particular applications to opiate addiction. But in a microdosing capacity, I have found psychedelics to provide, and side note, these are almost all exceptionally illegal with severe legal penalties in the United States. So listener, beware. The legal side effects often exceed the physical side effects.
Right.
But microdosing, and which means subperceptual, you are not experiencing any hallucinations whatsoever, has some very fascinating applications to both.
And are you referring, by the way, to all 3 of those, the DHT and the ibogaine, and then also the psilocybin? For microdosing? No,
this is, let me clarify. I'm referring to, in my case, psilocybin and ibogaine. Okay. And both of which are pretty, well, psilocybin's relatively easy to get hold of. Ibogaine is much more difficult to get hold of. And when I say microdose, I'll get more specific. I mean 1/100th of a, let's call it, moderately high to high dose. It is a very, very small dose. And I find these to provide me, at least, and this is consistent anecdotally, and I know that the plural of anecdote is not data. So, but at the same time, recognizing that it's going to be a while. I'm funding research at Johns Hopkins and UCSF and so on, but it's going to be a while before we have really good placebo-controlled randomized studies on all of these compounds, particularly in a microdosing context. They provide, for me, an extended, say, 2 to 3 day, so single dose in the morning on a Monday will provide me with an extended, moderate, let's just say 20% reduction in anxiety or depressive tendencies for 2 to 3 days. And if I up the dose slightly, then they are very useful for problem solving. And this has been observed with LSD, which is not my compound of choice, but it's very precise in its measurement, which makes it attractive for a lot of reasons. If you look at James Fadiman, for instance, who's been involved with psychedelic research for decades, and he was recruited at one point to conduct a study, or at least be one of the experimenters in a study that looked at how not quite microdosing. If we're talking about like 10 to 15 micrograms of LSD, probably closer to 100 or 150 micrograms could be used for solving hard science problems, meaning the 35 subjects, let's say, and all the exact details are in Tools of Titans, but from memory, see how I do, about 35 subjects, they're trying to design novel circuit boards or solve mathematical or physics problems that they've been stuck on for weeks or months. And 33 of the 35, something along those lines, had a solution at the end of a single day of treatment and supportive therapy. So those are very interesting to me.
And that was with LSD.
That was with LSD specifically.
And that dosage would be far, far less than anything that would cause you to begin tripping.
Well, we're starting to creep up. You will absolutely feel it at that dose. And I would suggest having supervision of some type, but it's more manageable than what you would consider a transcendental dose, or certainly a heroic dose, where you are probably not going to be of this reality for at least several hours. That is perhaps not going to be conducive to thinking about mathematical problems.
Right. So proceed with caution.